If you enjoy a story about an invasion of the Earth, how humanity would deal with Martians arriving, and how that all plays out, then you may enjoy reading The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds Special. War of the Worlds is a story that many people may recognize. It's a story about a Martian invasion. It begins with green flashes in the sky and cylinders landing. So, as the narrator is speaking to Ogilvy, Ogilvy has a classic line: chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1. As we know from the story, that assumption is incorrect. When the cylinder first lands, the narrator is struck by the fact that people are just going about their daily business and not really concerned about much. At this point, the cylinder hasn't been opened and nothing's really going on. That quickly changes as the cylinder is open, events begin to escalate, and people begin to realize that the military is not able to protect them from these new invaders, which of course leads to chaos and panic. The story follows our narrator as he makes his way throughout the countryside. A difference between the novel and the musical is that in the novel, our narrator is married and his wife goes somewhere safe. In the musical, our narrator has a girlfriend and she is trying to make her way to a ship to leave Britain. Throughout the novel, we begin to see that it's quite possible that the Martians will eventually take over the Earth and humanity will no longer be the ruling group. There is another difference between the novel and the musical. If you haven't read the story or seen the movie, I'm not going to give any spoilers. Suffice it to say that things turn around and the Martians lose their edge against the humans, and the novel War of the World ends with the narrator talking about the stress and self-doubt. The musical ends on a much more ominous note. And again, I'm not going to give any spoilers in case you haven't listened to it, but let's just say the ending isn't clear-cut. The musical and the novel each tell the story of an alien invasion. They're about the narrator questioning his role in the world, what will happen with humanity. They both have two very different endings. In the Britannica article that I read when I was doing research to put this together, it does mention that the narrator throughout the story talks a lot about the human-animal comparison. The narrator in the novel is thinking about how humans seem to the Martians compared to how humans look at ants. According to the article, the major takeaway from this particular novel is to have more compassion for nature. In other words, in your interactions, regardless of the species, to stop and think. Something I wholeheartedly agree with. And yes, I am one of those people who, when I'm doing my yard work, it does tend to take me longer than most. One, because I do the vast majority of it by hand, and two, because I take the time to make sure my little worms are covered up, and I apologize if I've suddenly caused a spider to have to move with her eggs and other things like that. The radio broadcast. On Sunday, October the 30th, 1938, at the Mercury Theater at 8 p.m., Orson Welles presented The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It's important to remember that in 1938, families were gathered around their radios. They didn't have computers and they didn't have cell phones. So on Sundays, it was family time around the radio. Unfortunately, a number of people missed the introduction. Edgar Bergen was a ventriloquist who performed with his dummy, Charlie McCarthy. So a number of families were listening to the wrap-up of that program and didn't switch over to CBS until 8:12, at which point the story was already well underway and they had missed the introduction. As I mentioned earlier, when Wells sold the rights to his story, The American purchaser changed the setting to America. That's important because that was part of what set off the panic. Widespread panic began in New York City because a number of the listeners had missed the introduction that this was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Part of the confusion may also have occurred because the broadcast after the introduction went into a weather report. It was then followed by an announcer saying they were going to a studio in New York where they'd be listening to music. Then there was an interruption. An announcer came on to say that an observatory had noticed explosions on Mars. The dance music comes back on and plays for a little bit, and then there is another interruption, this time saying that there was a meteor crash in Grover's Mills, New Jersey. There's a description of Martians and the announcement that 7,000 National Guardsmen had been wiped out. People are listening to this in their homes on their radio. You don't have a cell phone to text or call somebody. There is no computer to go online and check. The broadcast went on to talk about other cylinders that had landed in Chicago and St. Louis. As people are listening to this, they missed the introduction. They're hearing that 7,000 National Guardsmen have been wiped out. Of course, people are going to totally freak out, especially if they're not familiar with the War of the Worlds story. There were traffic jams, there was chaos and panic. Because of all of that, there was an investigation. The investigation done by the Federal Communications Commission decided that no laws were broken. However, the networks at that time did agree to be more careful about programming. Sadly, that's something that social media has failed to grab onto. Do you believe that there are some things need to be more carefully monitored? So I'm not going to go off on that rant. Now, the answer to the question, what do War of the Worlds and Citizen Kane have in common? The answer is Orson Welles. After the broadcast and all the media hype and the investigation, Orson was noticed by Hollywood and offered a contract in 1941. He wrote, produced, directed, and starred in Citizen Kane. An interesting fact that I learned researching about War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells sold the rights to War of the World. War of the Worlds was published as a serial. So in the UK, it appeared in Pearson's magazine, where the story was still kept with the setting in Britain. In the United States, it was published as a serial in the Cosmopolitan. However, in the United States, the setting of the story was changed to the United States. A little bit of information about the author, H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells began work at the age of 14. He went on to become a teacher, and the first book that he published was actually a textbook of biology in 1893. His first novel, The Time Machine, was published in 1895 and became an immediate success. Some of you may have seen the movie The Time Machine. There were 3 more novels before War of the Worlds, which was published in 1898 in book form. Prior to that, it had been published as a serial in 2 different magazines, one in the UK and one in the US. H.G. Wells was dedicated to social equality and world peace. After World War I, he believed human progress would happen through knowledge and education. One can only wonder what he would think of our world now in 2022. Wells believed that there would be another world war, and sadly, he was right. Wells had an amazing work ethic, and it was very interesting to read that he worked at his craft for 50 years. On average, he wrote 3 books a year, and each book went through several drafts before it was published. That truly is amazing when you consider the time frame that Wells was working in. There were no computers, and instead of just completing a novel and going, okay, that's it, just hand it in, I'm done, or just publish it, I'm done with it, he went through and reviewed it and made corrections and made changes. And again, it wasn't as simple as today where you simply hit a delete button and either type it or dictate it. It truly is astounding and impressive to think that he was producing 3 novels a year on average. And in 1995, Sony Music Entertainment released a musical version. The story is narrated by Richard Burton, a name that may be familiar to some of my viewers. It's a 2 CD set, and it comes with a book so you can follow along with the narration. It also provides the lyrics to all the songs. It has some incredible artwork and images in it. The back of the book gives a short bio on the narrator, Richard Burton, as well as the other actors and singers. Why did I decide to do War of the Worlds on October the 31st? Not because of the broadcast, but because some people may have their Christmas traditions. I have my Halloween tradition, which is to listen to the musical version of War of the Worlds every year. I enjoy the narration by Richard Burton, and the songs that are presented on this are just incredible. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever listened to this version. I hope you enjoyed this video about War of the Worlds, and we'll give the novel a try if you haven't read it before, and give the CD a listen. Let me know, is there something surprising you learned about War of the Worlds or H.G. Wells? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Until next time, happy reading!